Well, friends, the story of Naaman holds many lessons and contains many stories in just one single narrative. There is the story of how confusing power structures can be for those subject to their influence. There is the near-miss war between clashing men of power. There is the age-old pursuit of health and wholeness for those who are suffering. And it seems like the main actor in the drama is predictably a man of great stature, accomplishment, and importance. But here's the thing. Scripture is pretty daring. Scripture doesn't obey social customs or power structures, and Scripture, in this story, read even today, should turn our expectations upside down. Some of you may know, but a few years ago, I had a spinal fusion to cure a congenital deformity in my spine. After being sent home from the accomplished and well-known doctor who treated me, I had what was labeled a severe inflammatory reaction in my lower spine. I'm going to spare you the details, but I got my first ride on an ambulance where I pleaded for them to just knock me out, to give me anything that would just make me go unconscious to alleviate the pain. I wound up in the hospital, thoroughly drugged for days that just sort of rolled into hours. And during that time, I had some unfortunately honest Facebook posts that took place. So as a side note, don't ever leave your family member with a smartphone during a severe inflammatory reaction. But anyway, at one point in my haze, I remember a young caregiver coming to me. She gently touched my arm and she asked, "How are you doing?" I looked at her and I said, "I feel like I'm dying and like my body is shutting down." Without flinching, she bent in and said to me, "Yeah, you look like hell." And that's actually what's happening. We get people like you now and then who get sent home after having these traumatic spinal surgeries, but you've been traumatized. And we find that you're pretty similar to people who've been in serious car accidents. That's why you're in the ER. In fact, I'm here because your lungs are starting to collapse, and we need to prevent that from getting worse. So here, blow into this. She handed me this little gizmo called a spirometer, which I held for a second and said, "What do you mean? My lungs are collapsing. They feel just fine." "Really?" she said. "Because they don't sound very good. Why don't you just try blowing really hard into that and see how it feels?" Grudgingly, I blew and barely moved this small ball in the machine before sharp pains filled my chest and I winced. She stood patiently for what felt like a long time. I looked at her and I said, "I think my lungs are collapsing." I said to her, and I remember she smiled, and she began to walk me through a set of breathing exercises. You know, the funny thing is I can't even remember this young woman's name. I don't know what day it happened on. I don't know if she was a doctor. I don't know if she was a nurse or a CNA or what. I just remember that she acknowledged my pain in a way that made me feel truly validated, and her compassion was deeply real. Such were the words of the young Jewish girl taken into captivity to the wife of Naaman, a man who had battled and killed her people in war. "If only my Lord were with the prophet in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." Startlingly compassionate is the heart of this servant girl to care at all about the health of her captor, to acknowledge his suffering as a leper. This man undoubtedly brought her and her people terrible suffering, and yet she offers him compassion and points towards a path for healing and wholeness. But you know, sometimes just acknowledging another human being's suffering can be one of the most powerful acts of healing that can take place. Words of compassionate understanding can come from anyone, because God is tirelessly seeking us out to share with us the good news, and God is terribly indiscriminate in doing so. So remember, I asked there might be some conversation during this sermon, and we're getting to that point right now. I have a couple questions for you to consider and talk about. I wonder, if you look back on your life, who has shared words of understanding and compassion with you? What person or situation comes to mind? What did they say? Or what did they do that spoke to you? I invite you to take 5 minutes, find 3 or 4 people around you, and contemplate, share your thoughts about those questions. Let's take a few minutes. So there is an old Jewish fable that goes like this. An old woman had 2 watering cans which were attached to a yoke. Each day she put the yoke over her shoulders and went down to the river. She filled the cans and walked back to her modest hut. The water can on the right side of the yoke was fine and sturdy, and when she arrived home, it was always full. But the can on the left had a crack in it, and by the time the woman arrived home, half the water was usually gone. That water can always felt inferior to its partner. It was a shame that it was cracked and wasn't pulling its weight. One day, he turned to the woman and apologized for being defective. The woman smiled and gently said, "Did you think I didn't know that you had a crack and water dripped from you? Look at the path from the river to my hut. Do you see all the beautiful flowers that are planted and growing on one side of the path? Those are the flowers that I planted there, that you watered every day as I walked home from the river." So for a mighty warrior and commander of an army, listening to a young captive Jewish girl's advice would be shameful and humiliating, but she was fundamentally an inferior person, much like the cracked and broken bucket. This girl had 4 major strikes against her credibility and importance. First, she was Jewish. Second, she was young. Third, she was a she. She was a girl. And fourth, she was a servant. This was the consummate non-person in that age. Nameless, faceless, fairly worthless, seen as broken, seen as insufficient. The word for her in Hebrew was kal, which means small and insignificant. In Scripture, she has no name, and we never hear from her again. But you know, the fact that she was even in the Bible, that this verse with her words is in the Bible, the fact that the work of God is made manifest through this girl, and the fact that it is even mentioned is a profound testament that the God of Israel does not care for the social constructs of patriarchy and sexism. God's work does not rest solely in men. God is beyond these oppressive limitations of male domination and subjugation of women and slavery. God is beyond ethnocentric prejudice. The work of God happens beyond ageism. God is beyond nationalism, willing to heal the enemy of the state. God is fearfully just trashing all these structures in one verse. All these structures that these men fight for so vehemently and are willing to lay their lives on the line for. We think of this as brazen, but God is just being faithful, doing this out of love, foreshadowing the mighty work of the cross of Jesus Christ, which will be drug over the ashes of these once great nations and powerful kings, set high on a hill to forgive their sins and to offer grace for all, both those seen and unseen. And the God of Israel does this with one verse through a little slave girl. Women's voices have long sought to be silenced by men. In American movies, women are rarely the protagonists, and if they are, often the story is still somehow intertwined with a love story with a man, the assumption that being a woman alone makes you incomplete without a male partner. In politics, America has had a startlingly low number of female politicians, even though their voices represent 50% of the population. But lately, there's been the hashtag MeToo movement, now a wave of over 107 female voting members of Congress and the House, and as the Chicago Tribune article says, a wave of women has Congress looking more like America. It's about time. It is the year of the woman, they say, the year of the woman, to have women's voices heard. But it is nothing new for the gospel of Jesus Christ. For women have been changing the political destinies of nations and mighty warriors for eons, shaping the world not of men, but of humankind. This includes young girls we might not be willing to hear, young girls we cannot even see, young girls whom sexism still seeks to imprison, who serve as sex slaves. The voice of women everywhere are still laboring for equality. Here's the second set of questions for you to talk about together. How have you witnessed the struggle for gender equality taking place? How proactive are you in listening to women's voices in your life? What girl or woman's words have most deeply impacted you, and why? Let's take a few moments and talk it together. Friends, as I look out across the room, I've seen a variety of expressions. So I hope that your conversations have gone well and got you thinking. I pray you would continue having these conversations at home and with those that you love. I pray that in today's scripture, you have heard God's loving words of peace and wholeness spoken into your lives. I pray that you have listened to the women and girls in your life, knowing that their voices are often uniquely chosen by God to challenge us, to witness to us. God's never-ending pursuit of liberation for all children. I pray for those of us who are still learning to listen, for those of us who harbor some form of sexism, for those of us who lean on ageism, those of us diseased by ethnocentricity. I pray that we would have Naaman in us. Even if we bumble around and don't get it right on the first try, I pray that we could be fearless and courageous enough that we might consider listening to the non-person to find the unlikely one sent our way for healing and wholeness by the God of all creation. May this indiscriminate God, still speaking, be with all of us today, turning things upside down and inside out until we can bathe for one last time in the waters of righteousness and equality, until we can bathe again and again and again, until we as a people are cleansed of all that separates us from love, such that we might know grace, we might know healing, we might know wholeness. Amen.